Hello and welcome. I'm Geoff Schullenberger. This is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors each week to discuss one of our articles. This week I'm joined by Hamilton Craig, who has contributed a number of pieces to us now, many of them focused on earlier periods of history. He wrote an excellent piece on Andrew Jackson, another one on Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. And so he is a historian, City University of New York. This time, however, he has brought his historical insights to a very contemporary topic, which is the precipitous rise of Oliver Anthony, the viral backwoods singer who has come to national prominence in just the past month or so. So thanks for joining me today, Hamilton.
Thank you for having me.
This figure, Oliver Anthony, he's sort of, already gone through sort of several cycles. He emerged seemingly out of nowhere with the song Rich Men North of Richmond, which is the main, and he's released a number of other songs, but this is, by far the one the most people have heard and know him for. And which you focus on in the piece. Maybe before we get into the arguments, I'm curious, what's been your experience of watching the rise of this, quite talented vocalist and performer, seemingly out of nowhere through this kind of viral process? And how did what did you make of the kind of different phases of his reception?
Yeah, the different phases of his reception are stark, and I don't know if I have the full story on it because it's so it's produced a real volume of commentary, which it made me hesitate almost to contribute to it, but I ultimately feel that was worthwhile. But the basic phases was that when he first came out, it was heralded as a conservative anthem, which already is strange. I mean, that's already says a lot that's interesting about political climate of the country right now. Not even the climate, the structure of politics and how we think about political divides seems to me to be historically novel in that a guy who is writing a song that is basically a protest song of the poor against the rich was immediately recognized by everybody as a conservative right-wing spokesperson. That is odd. And the Republican Party embraced him. And the song was, I believe it was played at the Republican debates as walk-on music. And he released a statement opposing that, saying that, I'm not really, I can't be put in one political camp or the other. This is a song against the whole political class. That's one interpretation of what this Rich Men North of Richmond is referring to, is that it's people in Washington, D.C. There are other people who have suggested other meanings of that. Certain conservatives were anguished by that. There were some people on who were really pissed off by that, felt like he had, sort of spit in the face of people who made him famous. I think there was slight contrition on the part of progressive and left people who had really bashed him when he first came out. I'm not sure the extent of that contrition, but that's kind of the big swing in his career, is this coming out as this conservative hero and then now being seen as something a little more unclassifiable, I guess.
Yeah, and that was an interesting moment. I think I had sort of a response to one of these right-wing pundits who got very mad about him, basically just criticizing the people who were on stage at this Republican debate, which it's, I mean, come on. If you're a sort of right-wing pundit who claims to be at all sort of populist or anti-establishment GOP, it's pretty hilarious that you would then be offended that he would say, the guys on stage at the Republican debate were a bunch of, wealthy establishment hacks. That seems like a pretty basic point, but nevertheless, they got very mad in this kind of tribal way. One thing I pointed out was some right-wing influencer had some tweet where he was like, well, you see how they'll just sell you out because it's better for their career to suck up to the left or something like that. And it's that's 100% false in this case, because he definitely could, if he had wanted to be a sort of, minstrel Joe the Plumber figure on the right wing circuit, he could probably make a pretty good career of it.
No, I think that would have been the safer career move.
If he wanted to suck up to the Republicans, he'd probably, he could headline the RNC next year, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I thought it was very brave of him to say that. I don't think I think there are a lot of people who, no, I definitely think at that stage, especially because he had gotten no welcome from anybody other than conservatives, to then criticize that group of people was brave, I think.
And I mean, I sort of it's weird, to me that was kind of pivotal because, I had when I first encountered the song, I think one thing that I noticed was he has a strong voice and kind of
Yes.
presence as a performer. As soon as he, kind of shot to viral fame, there was a lot of sort of, somehow this seems very artificial or
Right.
astroturfed or something. And so that was something that was kind of interesting. And I think maybe I was too swayed by that to be kind of suspicious of what he represented. And, at least, and, maybe I'm being led astray in some way here. But I think when he did just say, yeah, those guys suck, referring to the Republicans.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, he's not just on the make. Clearly,
it casts him down. I don't know how virality works. I mean, I wish I knew what he did. I used to play music. None of my music ever went insanely viral overnight. I have not read nobody has presented any smoking gun or anything even resembling that he was some kind of artificial plant or something. There's just no evidence for that.
I mean, my most cynical moment was when I tweeted something like, like when I first came across him, I said something like, what's going to happen is at some point he's going to take off his mask like Mission Impossible style, and it'll be Ron DeSantis. This will, kickstart his campaign again. But I was obviously being absurd. But I mean, at that point, I was kind of trying to like take the whole, this is all some kind of astroturfed like fake thing to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ron DeSantis, his response to it, they were like, what do you think about the song? And he was like something like, the song is about how it's time to like send Sleepy Joe back to the basement or something like, it's just like the most like narrow partisan response. Is very depressing and very emblematic of what he's about and why I think that there is no real natural compatibility between that song and party politics. It's just something that's really can't be contained within that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting in relation to like, that there's been sort of a history of these songs that are taken up as conservative anthems. I mean, one funny example is Okie from Muskogee.
I was thinking that. I was like, why has nobody made this connection to Okie from Muskogee? I was waiting for the think piece that would do that.
Which, is, I mean, one thing that's interesting about that is, as I understand it, the genesis of the song was like they were literally, which begins with "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee," and like it was literally Merle Haggard and his band like driving past Muskogee, like getting stoned, and like making up the song as a joke. More because they were actually making fun of the people and that they were imagining there as this kind of, idealized version. So, I mean, and not in any kind of vicious way, but just that, the whole song was kind of a joke initially.
Yes.
And not necessarily at the expense of those people, but they were just kind of, spinning out this kind of somewhat hyperbolic fantasy. And in some sense, like, Merle Haggard and his band were not some kind of, like, upright...
No.
Sort of Christian townies or whatever, right? They were basically a bunch of sort of louche...
But they understood that culture. Like, that's the thing. The song is it's like a loving satire in a way. It's not like it could not have been written by someone who didn't have familiarity with the milieu that he's talking about. And I think it's a kind of, it's an affectionate song in a way. It's not sneering, really.
No, not at all. No, it's I mean, and I think that's part of why, it could be even though they weren't at all sort of earnest in the genesis of it, it could sort of be taken that way because they, there is a kind of sincerity to it as well. But I don't know. I mean, this is, it's quite a different sort of song. It's not a.
It is, and the linking of these things is interesting because it's the song that the new viral song that Okie from Muskogee is much more analogous to is the "Try That in a Small Town."
Right. Yeah, I
And
was
that
going to
song
mention that.
is always mentioned in the same breath with
Yeah.
Richmond, north of Richmond, and whether that makes sense is an interesting question. I think, like, why is it that we like? I think it's just there's something. The response to this song is so diagnostic of like how people envision the sort of political cleavages in America and how strange that sense is and how sort of, I don't know, kind of sclerotic it is. And people have these very immediate, simplistic kind of conditioned responses to some new cultural thing like this, something that is, I think, is pretty authentic and does not really exist within the frame of partisan politics. And yet people have immediately categorized it in this way. Why would anyone, it would have seemed strange. I'll say that it would have seemed strange to people just a few generations ago to assume that somebody singing a song with the lyrics that one found in Richmond, north of Richmond, would have any commonality with Ron DeSantis, or would have any commonality. Like, why? Like, I don't know what it's. I guess it speaks to, not to be cliched, but to just the way that cultural aesthetics have been positioned as like kind of definitive cleavages in our society. The kind of definitive divides are between, so that even from the moment you see him with his beard and his appearance, which it's like this person is like inherently biologically, committed to a whole spectrum of positions that they can't even be sort of imagined outside of. And I think that the song pointed out how confined we are by this sort of mass of political stereotype, and has also been a moment to re-examine that. And for, I think, some people, it has helped them to be critical about that, hearing this song and seeing change seeing him reject this kind of role that was carved out for him as like an adjunct to the Republican Party.
That's interesting, and it did kind of show up the limits of the Republican Party and its kind of attempts to channel and co-opt various kinds of populist tendencies. I mean, partly insofar as that you had the kind of the attempt to kind of appropriate it in the debate, and then his disavowal of that, and then also it was hilarious that you had the National Review and a few other right-wing publications write these kind of incredible screeds.
There's like, if you're working a job for bullshit pay, you need to get another job. I was like, that's the Republican Party I remember. All right, that's good.
Right. And so I think, what we saw there was that the Republican Party that we remember, it's still basically, that is the party. Oliver Anthony seems to know that. And then, as I said, even the people who, I believe even some of these kind of more supposedly anti-establishment pundits got very mad that he didn't kind of align himself with the Republicans, right? And so, so it does show up, as you say, these kind of cleavages. Now, kind of getting to the other, so, it did occur to me right when I first heard it that the exact point that you make at the beginning of the piece was exactly what struck me very early, which is, basically much of it, it's hard to imagine how it could be coded as a right wing or, in any traditional American sense, kind of conservative set of lyrics. I mean, in fact, much of it is kind of, it's kind of consistent with kind of generic sort of Occupy type kind of anti-elite, sort of inchoate sort of anti-establishment, anti-elite politics. Then there are these lines about welfare, right, which is kind of, and it did occur to me, when I first encountered it, like, if you cut just those couple of lines, then not only would it not code as right wing, it would almost certainly code as completely left wing.
Right. That's my curiosity. I do, a lot of left wing people who talked about the song, as I talk about in the article, were like, oh, I was loving this song until he said the goddamn thing about welfare. But I do think, to the earlier point, I don't know how much to trust that. Like, I do think there's a level on which we're at a point culturally where, like, the moment that guy, like, the moment you see his face, like, he's like, the left is just not gonna like him unless the song is like about how he regrets all of his like racist peers and wants to, reject. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I think that I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But yes.
Yeah, and that I think you're right. I mean, and two thoughts about that are sort of interesting. One, the whole aesthetic you're describing and as sort of alienating culture, through its kind of cultural signifiers to the left. I mean, the paradox here is that it's essentially identical with what was the sort of hipster aesthetic
Yes.
that kind of urban like urban white dudes in kind of hip areas tried to embrace, like,
He could own a brewery in 2010s Brooklyn. Yeah.
right, exactly. That there's kind of this like belated folk revival of people, and there was kind of this whole cultural moment. I mean, and there was kind of an interesting book put out by the journal N+1 that I think was called "What Was the Hipster," and it's sort of a collection of essays about basically about that moment. And one of the things it points out is that it essentially was this the or there's one piece in it which I can't remember who it's by, but it's kind of about the class politics of it and how basically a lot of it was kind of appropriating these signifiers of the white working class.
No, sure. It's cultural appropriation of the first order. I mean, this, like, yeah, y'all saying, like, it still exists. Like, there is both in a general culture level, like that, like having a beard and being, wearing like a lumber jacket and saying y'all and saying folks and like stuff like that. That is like, there is that, which is just like that people feel, it's so like painfully estranged from any kind of authenticity that, they can't be blamed for just like grasping at some cliche that they associate with like ruggedness or something. But it has, on the left, it has this, and the like political left, radical left people, it has a more pernicious form that I find very frustrating, which is where they handpick their, the sort of like, hillbilly people that are acceptable to them. Like there's this, they love Woody Guthrie, and they love this idea of this sort of old time red scarf wearing, like Blair Mountain Appalachian kind of left wing in America. And they, people who have nothing to do with that, like assert that is, those are the authentic people. And all the people you see, driving a big truck or something, well, those people are actually rich, or those people are actually fake, or those, and they actually, they know, because they recognize that it's a huge indictment of leftism, that it has so utterly failed to capture like this big sector of the American working class. And so they try to explain that away by picking their sort of mouthpieces from history for a time when, that class was sort of more aware or virtuous, or who the real members of it were. And sometimes they themselves will be like, well, my grandmother was Appalachian and I know blah, blah, blah. It's the same. It's like, it follows the same dynamics as any other form of cringeworthy cultural appropriation, I guess. But it has this political valence that I think is kind of about erasing the actual people because they're too inconvenient to deal with, because the fact is they don't want to get on board with these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another thing that occurred to me is there was kind of this attempt to, like, I think there was something called like Redneck Revolt or something that was supposed to be that, and then
yeah, I remember Redneck Revolt is a classic example. Yeah, I remember Redneck Revolt.
Yeah, and then there's also this John Brown Gun Club.
Yeah, John Brown. There was a Socialist Rifle. That was another one. Socialist Rifle Association. Yeah.
And then I remember there being something about, I think back in 2020 with those protests, sometimes the John Brown Gun Club guys, and they were, they usually looked the part of, they with the beards and the flannel shirts and so on. But then there would kind of be like some op-ed from somebody being like, even though there are comrades, I just don't feel comfortable with like around white men with guns or whatever. So I think that's in a way that's a symptom of how, as you're saying, just this set of signifiers, I think particularly in the past sort of 5-7 years has gotten just sort of too politically uncomfortable.
You see it in the response. The response of the left to Anthony is annoying to me. Like this, one of my good friends, all of my friends in academia are left wing. Obviously, there's no just I made peace with that, and but I tried to, so we talked about this song, and I talked about this article to them, and one of them was like, now to be fair, I haven't actually listened to this yet, so I can't really condemn it, but Billy Bragg, like left wing English songwriter, was like, here's my corrected proof of the song. It's called Rich Men Earning North of $1 Million or something. And there were all these other people who came out with things like that. We're like, whoops, there's still a few mistakes in the way in his song. So actually it should be about guillotining billionaires, but it was, that kind of thing. This such an infantilizing, condescending kind of perspective towards people like him. No curiosity about what they actually think.
Well, and Billy Bragg, who's become just completely insufferable, but who sort of took up the mantle of Woody Guthrie by doing the those albums where they performed his previously unperformed songs. So I guess he thinks that he's somehow the true successor of Woody Guthrie. I think the really key part of your argument is, again, the left's response and my response when I first saw it was much of it is targeting. It would be talked about as well, he's punching up or whatever, but then, but what about these complaints about, obese people on welfare? Isn't he sort of punching down and isn't he engaging in these sort of Reaganite tropes? And so that's that's clearly the crux of the left and liberal dislike of the song. And so what you argue in the piece, which is an argument we've published a few other things that sort of explore on this, is that there is a kind of left, or we might say broadly populist, but not necessarily right wing populist line of thinking that is more suspicious of welfare, doesn't frame it entirely as this, I don't know, this sort of sacrosanct thing, but instead sees it as part of the same complex.
Absolutely. No, the hard left does not like welfare. The real left, as I understand it, that yeah, absolutely, it's a way of, it's a way of buying off the poor. It's a way of sort of weakening people's will to revolt, and it's also it's sort of the way that people talk about farm subsidies sometimes, that it subsidizes employers because it means that they can afford to pay non-survival wages because the government will pick up the tab. I did see some left-wing people who were saying that was the critique Oliver Anthony was making, which I felt was kind of wishful thinking on their part, that they were like, oh, it's a systemic critique of capitalism. I don't think that it is, but there's a part of the left that also doesn't like welfare. The people who do like welfare are what you would call progressives, I guess.
It's not necessarily, in the way you describe it, is it's not necessarily a kind of critique that's articulated in the song as just a sort of attitude or position that is widely held by quite a few people of all races and in different kinds of communities, and so that it has been documented historically, and it is something that that there's a long sort of working class tradition of. So, to establish that, you go through the work of historian Christopher Lasch, as well as Jonathan Reeder. Perhaps we could just talk about that for a minute.
So Christopher Lasch's basic insight into the working class in America, he's not necessarily the first person to say anything about this, but his formulation of it, I think, is really smart and effective. And it needs to be set against a more shallow interpretation that is often offered, which is this temporarily embarrassed millionaires idea, which is based on a quote by John Steinbeck. That's the idea that, everyone buys into this Horatio Alger myth. And so the poor and the working class in America support policies that are really intended to benefit millionaires because they themselves hope to be millionaires in the future. That is not true. That's a really, really dumb idea. It does nothing to explain why do so many working class people not like the rich if they hope to emulate them. The thing that you find in Lasch is this idea that workers in America, what they really aspire to is this kind of middle class status that comes from owning something of your own, having some measure of independence. The kind of ideal of this, the kind of avatar of this that people carry in their minds is like a yeoman farmer, or like a kind of an independent landed person who, kind of can have their own homestead and the liberty that comes with that. And people who form the base of the American class came from circumstances where that was either their condition to some extent or their aspiration. People who came from Europe, were often independent, skilled craftspeople, tailors and so on and so forth. Or so if they came from Eastern Europe, they were more likely to be craftspeople. If they came from Southern Europe, more likely to be farmers, possibly peasants and tenant farmers, or possibly independent farmers. And if they came from within America, they were probably family farmers of some type. If they were Black people who came from the South, they might have been independent farmers. They might have been tenant farmers. All of these groups of people either had or aspired to this kind of what is sometimes called by historians the old middle class, meaning people who were proprietors, who could own something of their own, own a kind of business of their own, or own their own land, were not really in the condition of employees, did not understand themselves as part of a proletariat, part of a sort of permanent laboring class that will always depend on sort of the means of production that's owned by someone else. That idea, identifying themselves as that, was something they were very reluctant to do because their sort of culture had not shaped them to aspire in that way. And then the New Deal and the period after the New Deal allowed the American working class to kind of realize some of these ambitions in a small way. Owning homes, obviously there's serious, important discrimination in the way that those benefits are distributed. But there is created a class of American workers that are, the term that was used at the time, it's kind of a clunky term that sociologists who were trying to explain what the American working class was in the 50s and 60s, they would say embourgeoised, like they had been made bourgeois because they owned enough and they had enough kind of a semblance of a middle class life, even if they were technically proletarian, that they really had the ethos of more like small business people than the ethos of a kind of European working class that joined left-wing parties. And so this is all kind of explains why in America it seems that values of independence, values of sort of self-sufficiency, values of respectability, honor, these kind of things, which are all cast by the left as kind of false consciousness and reactionary sorts of values, why they're so persistent. As it's not because people are temporarily embarrassed millionaires, it's because I said in the article, they're temporarily embarrassed homesteaders, which maybe is a kind of a cutesy formulation, but it captures that their aspirations are not to be like Jeff Bezos. Their aspirations are to have a kind of a measure of independence and autonomy. And they don't want to give that up to accept themselves as just part of kind of the laboring classes of the world, part of the proletariat of the world. And that doesn't mean that they don't have class consciousness and that they aren't critical of exploitation, but they criticize it from a certain perspective that has important discrepancies from the perspective from which the sort of conventional left criticizes it. And one of the places this shows up, there are all kinds of places this shows up, but one of the places this shows up that brings out a lot of intense emotional responses because that is this not liking government handouts, is totally inimical to the kind of ideal of respectability and independence that still, I would say, is an important part of the mentality of at least a big segment of the American working class. That is really what I was getting at in the piece.
Yeah, and I think, what's important is you're not saying this position is right or wrong, but that I think, the left critique of it is often that it's that it's somehow incoherent. If you are anti-elite or anti-establishment or criticize the wealthy, then like that means you have to be kind of pro welfare, which may be the case, but the point is that there is a sort of long-standing position that manifests, and it's not it's internally coherent and should be at least taken seriously.
To the Ron DeSantis's of the world, it appears internally incoherent that somebody like him wouldn't support the Republican Party. The point is that there are so many claims made on this person and on people like this. There are so many people who are like, well, if you feel that way, then you have to accept this, and the third thing, all of these things that are part of my political project and require me having more power, and that is unsustainable. In the 19th century, after the Civil War, you see the emergence of all the kind of third party movements and factions within the parties that break away from the rest of the party. Like the Western Republicans are very different from the Eastern Republicans and support different currency policies and things like that. And there's a faction of the Democrats that's very different from like the sort of old planter bourbon Democrats. And there's these kind of, and some of them will coalesce into third parties. And some of them, and you see that very much happening today. There's these kind of old guards of both parties. And then there are these other elements that are trying to capture, that are trying to express in some ways the actual concerns of people at the base that are just like, are not expressed through these elite formulas of either right or left. And I think this is a song that what is powerful about it is that it's just, there's no propaganda coup in this song for anybody who is not willing to actually change their politics to meet the kind of demand from below, to actually try to express what the American working class, I think, wants. Requires an effort of, of flexibility and curiosity. And that's sort of, I think it's real value.
All right, great place to leave it. So thanks for taking the time and for contributing this piece, which I really think, sheds more light on this song and its broader significance than much of anything else, and quite a bit of has been written about it. This shows us something that has not really been explored elsewhere. So
thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, my pleasure. That will be all for this week's Compact Conversations. As always, remember, Compact is a reader-supported publication. Please subscribe. compactmag.com/subscribe if you have not, and gain access to Hamilton's recent piece as well as all of his prior work for us, and much more to come, I hope. Also, remember, if you're enjoying this podcast, to give us 5 stars on the app and subscribe. Thanks again, Hamilton.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.
Good day. Bye-bye.